Hello, and welcome to another video lecture for Mr. Moser's 8th grade U.S. history class. This is a second part video on our look at the history of World War I. In our previous video, we talked about the causes of World War I, known as mania, militarism, alliances, imperialism, nationalism, and of course, assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Today's video lecture, we're going to take a little bit of America's role in the early years of the conflict. And this is titled America Attempts to Avoid the War. When the war broke out in Europe in the summer of 1914, America sought neutrality. Neutrality means to refuse to join in the conflict and take sides. And for most of the early phases of the war between 1914 and 1917, America will be technically neutral. It means it does not join either the Allies or the Central Powers. Main reason for that was Americans really didn't feel this was none of their concern. Since most of the fighting was raging in the continent of Europe, most of the Americans figured that was their problem over across on the Atlantic. Another major factor why a lot of Americans did not want to be involved is because we had so many immigrants. 1 out of 3 Americans, a third of all Americans, were immigrants because of that great wave of immigration. And many of these immigrants were now in these warring nations and did not want to have to fight in a new country against their old country. And Americans put a lot of pressure on their political leaders to keep us out of the conflict, and were very successful. A popular song at the time was called "I Didn't Raise My Boy to Be a Soldier." This was very influential on the ideas of many Americans of this was not our conflict. This was not our reason to be involved in this war. The American president at the time was a guy named Woodrow Wilson. President Wilson actually had to seek re-election for his second term as the war was raging in Europe. And Wilson ran a campaign pledge of keeping us out of the conflict. And in large part, that what helps him get re-elected is that he maintained that promise, that he kept America actually neutral and did not join the British or the French and the Russians on the Allies, or didn't join the Central Powers of Germany, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire. But even though we were technically neutral, we really weren't fully neutral. War was actually really good business for American industry and American farms. President Wilson agrees to loan money through the American financial bank systems to both England and France so that those two countries could buy products from the United States. U.S. industry and U.S. farms are selling products to the Allies, which is really a massive economic boom for our country's economy here in the 1900s. The total value of U.S. exports during the war between 1913 to basically 1917 grew from $2.4 billion to $6.2 billion. This is a huge amount of impact in the nation's economy as these countries are buying American-made products, American farm products, industrial products. It's good for industry. It's good for farmers. The Allies are buying things from us like wheat to bake bread for their food, brass, rubber, automobiles, machinery, and other manufactured goods. So this was really good for American business. So even though we technically were neutral, we were supplying food and materials to the Allied side. And because we were supplying material and food resources to the Allies, the Central Powers were very angry at the American supplying of their enemy, because to help them win the war, they needed to starve out their enemy forces. So during the war, Germany begins threatening Allied shipping, including American ships that are traveling across the Atlantic, bringing this wheat and other manufactured products. Germany did not have a very big navy like the British, but it did have a relatively new technology that was being implemented in World War I called the U-boats. Now, submarines have been around for a while. In fact, the first known submarine was during the American Revolutionary War. And the Confederacy even had a submarine during the American Civil War. But these underwater boats called submarines took a massive technological improvement at the outset of World War I. And Germany had invested pretty heavily in these ships that could go underwater undetected and then come up into these lanes where the ships were traveling across the Atlantic and then sink them through the use of torpedoes. This is a way for Germany to put a stranglehold on the allies of England and France, particularly, who were getting all this food and manufactured supplies from the United States, and actually ends up warning American ships that, they are subject to be attacked by these submarine warfare of the German U-boats. In fact, the picture you see here down in the lower left-hand corner was an advertisement that ran in a New York newspaper, basically warning passengers on board steamships that they could be subject to German submarine warfare. And what's interesting about this particular advertisement is that right above this warning notice that the Imperial German Embassy put into this American newspaper, right above it, there is an advertisement for a ship called the Lusitania, which is going to have a very important role here in this next series of events. The sinking of the Lusitania was a massive international incident in 1915. The Lusitania was a large cruise ship, think like Titanic. On May 1st, 1915, off the coast of Ireland, a German U-boat sunk the Lusitania. Now, the Germans claimed that the Lusitania, besides carrying passengers, was carrying also supplies for the Allies, and specifically for Great Britain. And so they target the ship and sank the ship. Hundreds of people died on board, including many Americans. Not only was England and the Allies upset, but so were many Americans, because these were American lives that were lost. And so even though there's this great sense of being neutral, not getting involved in the conflict, there is a large outcry of anger by what happened at the Lusitania. This is only a few years, 3 years after the sinking of the Titanic, which sunk by striking an iceberg, but that memory was still very fresh in everybody's mind. The large loss of life that took place. Now, Wilson does not want America to get involved in the conflict. He actually sends a really nasty letter of protest to the German government. Basically says you need to stop the submarine sinking of American ships and other vessels crossing the Atlantic. The loss of life was too great, and is able to get Germany to concede to slow down their submarine warfare. Does not ask Congress to declare war. Congress probably wasn't going to declare war anyway because of this incident, but we start seeing a shift in public opinion about Germany and its actions because of the sinking of the Lusitania. Doesn't cause us to go to war yet, but it does begin making more Americans aware of these attacks of American ships, and this was kind of like the last straw for a lot of Americans. What does bring America into the conflict really kind of takes place starting in January of 1917. The war has been raging on now for 3 years, and both sides had kind of reached a stalemate, meaning that neither side had gained an advantage. They were kind of in gridlock along these trenches, as we'll learn about in another topic. Germany needs to do something to change the game, and so they decide to release their submarine warfare again, have unlimited submarine attacks, attack any merchant vessels crossing the Atlantic from America to the allies of Great Britain. Because of this unrestricted submarine warfare, more American merchant ships are being sunk, including loss of life of Americans on board these merchant ships. The British also are running on fumes. They are running low on men, they're running low on money, and they have in their possession a top secret telegram called the Zimmermann telegram, or the Zimmermann note. The Zimmermann telegram was a secret note sent from a German diplomat to the Mexican embassy. Basically, what this note said was that if Mexico agreed to join the Central Powers, Germany would help Mexico defeat the United States, and if they would help them defeat the United States, Mexico would maybe claim all this land of the American West, all that land that Mexico lost in 1848 with the war with Mexico, that Mexican cession. So we're talking like Texas, California, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, Utah, all that southwestern part of the United States. Germany would help Mexico reclaim that territory. Now, the British have this. They've been kind of sitting on this for a while, and they decide to leak it out to the press and leak it out to the Americans that they have this secret note. Because of the Zimmermann telegram, the secret communication between Germany and Mexico to try to bring Mexico and also Japan, but Mexico was a main concern for Americans at the time, into this conflict. And because of this new sinking of submarines, of this unrestricted warfare on American shipping, this was kind of the last straw. And so on April 2nd, Wilson goes to Congress with this new evidence and says, Congress, Germany is being very threatening to us, and we need to actually declare war. According to the Constitution, it is the Congress that has to have a vote on whether or not we declare war or not. And so Wilson goes and gives a speech on April 2nd and asks Congress to declare war. Are we ready for a war? Not whatsoever. These are the size of the armies of the major nations involved in World War I. Russia, in the outbreak of war in 1914, had the largest army at 12 million soldiers. Germany had 11 million soldiers. The French had 8 million. Great Britain had 4 million. Remember, that's all that militarism, all that buildup of military forces in Europe. America, not really. 300,000 soldiers were basically full-time soldiers in our entire army. So we were not ready for a conflict whatsoever. But regardless, on April 6, 1917, Congress officially draws up articles of declarations of war against Germany, and we are now at war against the Central Powers. And that year of 1917, we are going to have to swell our numbers of soldiers from 300,000 men to 3 million soldiers that will be sent over to Europe to fight in the battles in World War I. And that will be done because of volunteers, because of people volunteering and wanting to join the fight, or because of something called the draft. And we'll learn more about those topics at a later date. So America tries to stay out of the conflict. We were pretty successful between 1914 and 1917. The president at the time, President Woodrow Wilson, wins a campaign re-election promise of he kept us out of the war. Many Americans wanted nothing to do with this conflict. But as the war in Europe dragged on, Americans were no longer isolated or felt isolated from this conflict. Thank you for listening, and have a great rest of your day.